morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Today we celebrate Samhain. And this is my visual aid for the day. And the reason I wrote it out is because Samhain sounds nothing like it is. And this is the Gaelic or Irish pronunciation of it. And Samhain is the last of the 4 quarterly fire festivals. And our Deb and Diane was here in August and told us about Lufthansa. And I really thank them for the times that they presented information about this. They were so knowledgeable and they loved. So I'm following a little in their footsteps. So. Well, Samhain is a pagan celebration that was basically in the Celtic communities of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And this in particular, as I said, is the Irish translation of Samhain. I think it's quite notable that Samhain was celebrated over 2,000 years ago with the pagans, and as an ushering in of the harvest. It began on October 31st, when the harvest was stored, and it went through November 1st. And I have the colors of Samhain: black, which is the darkness of the season. As we all know, we're coming into the darkness. And many of us are not too happy, but I think at this time it's good to start to preparing to enjoy the darkness a little more. And orange is Yule, and that's the winter solstice, which we're coming to get light. So these were how these colors originated. Now, on October 31st, all the fires in the village would be left to burn out as they were collecting the harvest. So we knew by the time that we got to the giant bonfire, the entire village was black and dark. And the reason for that is that each would take the fire from the giant bonfire back with them and light the hearth again. And it needed to be on for 3 months. If it went out, you may have some misfortune. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about how Samhain would be celebrated in a Celtic community. So let's hear from somebody from that community. Now that the last apples are picked, the hay, oats, and corn is gathered and saved in the barn, it's time for us to celebrate Samhain as we welcome the Celtic New Year. The year begins in the dark that we call winter. Now, back in the ancient times, there were only 2 seasons: winter, summer, and winter. So that's why this is the beginning of winter, the dark end of the cycle. We must learn to follow the example of the earth, which is now beginning to rest. Embrace the darkness, for out of darkness grows light. We know at this time it was believed that the veil between the living and the dead was very thin, spirits could easily come through, either your ancestors or other spirits. So people wished that their ancestors would come through, but they never told them to come through, because you never told the spirits what to do. Actually, there was quite an unusual relationship in those days with the spirits. You never wanted to offend them. You always wanted to appease them, because you never know what a spirit would do if they got angry. Or if it was a playful spirit, what kind of a trick they'd play on you. So, on this night, people would dress up as animals or monsters in order to disguise themselves, because you didn't want a bad spirit to come and kidnap you. Costumes were always a form of protection, not to scare people, like recent Halloween, you scare people. That was never the case in any way. You didn't want them to know who you were. So the people, in preparation for the night, would have their turnip. Now I brought a turnip here. I didn't carve it because we all know how difficult it is to carve a turnip.
Yeah, really.
But they did. This is what they did. They carved it and put a candle in it to welcome the spirits. I'd like to begin the first part of the evening. So let's again hear from one of our Celtic villagers who will talk about their traditional dumb supper they will have tonight. Dumb, D-U-M-B. And we'll understand why it's called dumb. And this is probably a young man speaking. Tonight my family will have a very special supper. We'll set a place at the head of the table for the ancestors. When we serve them, we cannot look directly at the seat, because if we see the dead, surely misfortune will come to us. We walk backwards to avoid this. I think this is kind of as fun as long as we don't trip. Actually, as I read about this, what people would do is they'd walk backwards, and if they dared look, they had to start all over again. So you can imagine carrying the food backwards, trying to get it at the place. So it was a big ordeal, this event. We would all sit in silence while we waited for the spirits to arrive. I really wondered how they knew when they arrived, but when we're done, we'll bring food into the woods for the puka, our mischievous spirit. So after they ate, the children would play games to entertain the spirits. The parents would talk to the spirits about what happened during the past year. Before they left to go to the bonfire, they would open all the doors and the windows so the spirits could come in and eat the tasty cakes that they baked. And they had certain cakes, and there was a big ordeal doing this. This was a big event. So our young man said, Well, I better make sure the fires are totally out in the cottage before we go to the giant bonfire. Harvest stored, animals barned, what a busy night. So now we're on to the giant bonfire, which was always held in the center of the village. And they had a big giant wheel that they would turn around until there were flickers, and it represented the sun. So eventually the fire would start up, and it was a huge fire. Now the main person would be the druid. The druid was the priest. He was the person who was the most intelligent in the village, who had direct communication with the gods and goddesses, which were many. It took 20 years to learn how to become a druid. So the druids at that time were probably a little elderly. Also in the celebration would be the pagans and the witches. The witches, of course, were the ones who were the herbalists. They loved nature. You know, that they were very positive. Not the depiction of the witches through the years. I'm not sure how that happened. But it certainly is a misconception. And as we know from later on, Salem witch trials, so we know that it was very serious. And even in America, when it came over, especially in the colonial towns. So at this celebration, there were sacrifices of livestock and fruit or vegetables. And the people would all dance around the bonfire. They wore costumes. And the costumes, again, were for protection, just in case one of these bad spirits slipped in. So there was always that fear. I was reading that back a little earlier, what the pagans would do around the bonfire, they would place skulls of their ancestors.
Mm.
And this was, again, to protect themselves, not so much from the spirits, but from winter coming. You know, it was those countries in the winter are very, very damp, rainy, and cold. So you really need the fireplace going on all the time. So at the end of the celebration, the family would take, I guess they had, I don't know how they carried it, but they'd go back to their home and light their fire. Now, also, when they got home, they would, on their doorsteps, they would leave food. Because there may be some wandering spirits that they needed to feed. So they had the windows open for dessert, and outside they had food. So they felt that the spirits were very well taken care of. And this was a very serious ritual. The Celts were very spiritual people who believed in nature and supernatural powers. They worshipped natural forces such as the sun, the moon, and the stars, and believed in the presence of spirits and gods. And many of these practices centered on spells, incantations, and rituals. So it's a very, very rich tradition. But the gradual evolving of Samhain into Halloween began in the early churches. We have a couple of popes who the church was getting worried about the pagan practices. And as we know, they would like to have wiped out all paganism. And what they did is one of the popes moved All Saints' Day from May to November. And another one also called Samhain Halloween. And so they thought that this would, get rid of wipe out the pagan celebrations. It did not. Samhain is celebrated today. It really had a comeback, I think, in the 80s when the Wiccan witches really started to practice more. And so it was never wiped out, nor should it be. And I was thinking that it probably would be good to have a talk on the Wiccan witches and their herbal practices, and there's so much to it. I certainly couldn't go into it now, but I thought it would be quite interesting. And one of the things I think that has gone over to Halloween is called souling, where people in the village would go and knock on the doors and ask for food. And in return, they would either sing or say a prayer for the dead. And I think that's how the tradition came of going to the houses asking for food. And of course, the costumes, we know where that originated. The skull and bones may be somewhat from the ancient tradition of using the skulls as a protection. So I think what I would like to do now is not so much go into Halloween or anything like that, but to begin our personal tribute to the folks we have here or anybody else that we want to talk about, which was a practice. There was always an altar for the dead. And this is our altar that we have here. We have the leaves signifying the dying of the trees, the resting of the earth, and of course the turnip, which was used to welcome the dead. The corn the harvest is done, and the apple had really very special significance. And it was used in many rituals, many to find a mate, as a lot of rituals were. So what I would like to do is to have anyone that wishes to do so, or as the Spirit moves you, just tell us a little bit about who's up here.